So welcome everyone to Interior Design and You, Session 2, How to Identify Your Personal Style. For those of you who joined us last week for Session 1, which was all about 5 elements interior designers think about when they're designing a space, welcome back to Session 2. And if you missed it, you can find it on YouTube or on IGTV if you just look for Modsy's account. So on YouTube, we're Modsy, and on Instagram, we are at Modsy Design. So you can catch up there, but no worries if you missed it, because all of these sessions, well, they are kind of created to build on top of each other. They're also made to watch individually. So today we're going to talk about something I'm really excited to talk about, and that is style and identifying your personal style. Before we jump in, I want to introduce myself and my team who's here today with me. I'm Alessandra Wood. I am the VP of Style at Modsy, and I'm here with Maddie Warner and Karina Lemarinere, who are both 2 members of our creative and marketing team at Modsy. They will be our moderators, and you'll see them in chat, and they'll be fielding questions. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of tonight's session, but they'll try to give you some, if there's some quick and easy answers along the way. Feel free to chat and have fun tonight. Now, if you're sitting there and you're like, oh my God, the chat's in the way and it's distracting, you can close out of the chat. You can also, if you'd like to just see my video, you can pin my video too, or you can close out of my video entirely and just listen and watch the presentation. So if you have any challenges or need any help, definitely reach out, and we'll try to tech support virtually. But hopefully that's a good place to start with this new world of Zoom webinars. So again, thanks so much for coming today to join us to talk about style. So we have taken a little bit of an atypical approach to talking about style. One of the things that we hear a lot from people is they don't even know where to start when it comes to talking about how to identify their own style. So we came up with this interesting and novel way to sort of think about 5 aspects that might go into certain styles and see where you might fall in the spectrum. So after you leave this class tonight, you can really have a better command of why you like what you like and how to find more of what you're drawn to. So typically when we talk about style, we might talk about things that are, we might use terms that are really stylistically driven, like mid-century modern or minimal or boho. And so tonight we're going to use those terms, but we're going to show you where and how to find them on these 5 spectrums of style. So the moral of the story is, one thing that we know about style, and it's true for all of us, is that there's so many different inputs and inspirations that we have regarding style throughout our whole lives that most of us aren't really stuck or obsessed with one style. In fact, we oftentimes pull from many different styles, and all of us are essentially eclectic by nature, because we have all of these different inputs. You might take inspiration from your parents, your grandparents, pop culture, places that you've traveled, and all of those different inspirational moments infuse the things that you're attracted to and what you love. And so hopefully, coming out of tonight's class, you'll have a couple of ideas on how you can merge all of the things you love into one space. The other key I'll call out here is style is something that's super, super personal. And what you love is what you love, and that's really the most important thing. So as designers can help you identify your style, but we really believe at Modsy that it's really important that you have a space that you love and reflects who you are. And it's not up to me to judge if I love it, because I'm not living there. I'm sure some of you probably don't love how I live, and that's okay, because this is my space and this reflects me. So really, we hope that you are daring and accepting of your own personal style, because that's how we don't want to judge. So like I said, tonight we'll talk about these 5 spectrums and dive into what they mean and what they look like in the world of style. So I'm going to jump right in. The first one we're going to talk about is empty versus full. And you might be thinking, is this about hunger? But it's not. When we think about this notion of empty versus full, we're thinking about how much stuff is in a room. And so here I have two examples of one room that is pretty stark and one room that's chocked full of objects. Some of the words that come to mind when we look at these two rooms, which are indeed quite different styles, are words that might help you find more of these if you like these two extremes. So in our empty room, things like minimal, contemporary, modern, those are great keywords to search if you're drawn to something like this. Maybe it's a little too minimal for your taste. If you are leaning more towards a style that feels more full, that has a lot of different objects in a space, that has color and pattern, certain words that you might use to describe those spaces are things like eclectic, bohemian, maximalism. And so we see these two styles as representative of these two elements in a space. But like we said, they're a spectrum. And so one thing that's really fun when we think about this as a spectrum is it gives us opportunities to see kind of what might meet in the middle or 75% along that scale. So that empty space might feel really stark to you. And you might wonder how anybody could live in this all white sort of perfect, maybe space age era space. And you might also be looking at that full space and thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, that's way too chaotic for me. There's way too much going on there, and that's not appealing to me. And so here we have an example of an image of a space that we think kind of meets these two, maybe not quite in the middle, but sort of blends two of the elements that we see for each of them. And so this one we've called out as being this kind of contemporary eclectic space. So we see some of the minimal elements in that coffee table, in that sofa, in the color palette that is higher contrast and a little bit restrained, though it has that pop of yellow. And we see some of the more quote unquote full elements in the way that the bookcases are styled, in the gallery wall and the back wall. So here we have the space that is taking different parts of both of those two different spectrums. Another example is something that if you're, a big reader of shelter magazines or design blogs, you might have heard of Minimalist Maximalist, and this is a style that was pretty popular in 2020. It's a style that really takes minimalist shapes. So if you look at the shapes of the furniture in this room, it's really similar to some of the shapes that we see in that empty room. We have the curvature of the chair and the sofa. They're pretty sleek. They're really sculptural. But then the color palette and some of the materials make this room feel a little bit more maximalist. So while it is edited and it is pretty minimal, we have these elements of pop and high contrast and excitement that's added by the marble coffee table and that blue velvet chair. The next spectrum that we'll talk about is a spectrum, the old versus the new. This one is near and dear to my heart as a lover of vintage and antiques. So when you're looking at your space and designing your space, you might be someone who wants everything to be vintage or antiques, or maybe you are not that dedicated to antiques. You're not the Emily Gilmore. And maybe you're someone who wants everything to be brand new. You want to go to a store and be able to buy everything right off the shelf and have it basically new and made for you. But there's a lot of in between there. You don't have to choose just one. So the images that we have here sort of showcase on the left. The old is this beautiful Parisian apartment that is just filled with incredible antique and vintage pieces. And then the image on the right from Crate and Barrel is something that really is really of the times. Everything is new, and it's a really beautiful modern space. So as we think about different terms or style terminology that might pair up with these two design elements, we have on the old side something like classic, formal, American traditional. On the new side, we have things like contemporary, modern, mid-century modern. So if you're finding yourself more drawn to one of these spaces, those are great terms to search for when you're doing a Google image search or on Pinterest. So is it possible to combine these two things? Absolutely. And that's actually how I live in my spaces. I have a mixture of vintage and antiques and new pieces. And honestly, I think that's a way to create a space that has a little bit of depth and a little bit of history in it. But here we have this image of a style that we call Victorian Farmhouse, something that also is a little bit of a, I don't want to say trendier style, but a design trend that we're definitely seeing in 2020, where people are mixing modern and antique pieces or new and old pieces. So here, well, actually, I think all of these pieces are new pieces. Many of them are taking inspiration from antique shapes and forms. So even if you're buying everything new, you can still get this mixture of old and new styles within your space. And so here we have that coffee table with those beautiful turned legs that's leaning and kind of speaking and evoking antique design. We have the sofa that is much more modern and transitional. The prints on the pillows are leaning a little bit more towards this modern transitional print. And then you have that mirror in the background that has this old regal antique feel to it. Feels like something you might find in a Parisian loft. But really what the space is doing is pulling in these notions of old and new styles. Another way to combine this old meets new is actually to push it really to its limits. And so in this image, we have a very minimal dining room table with chairs and an actual antique piece. And so that sideboard there is an antique piece that we had created in 3D so that we could play with this mixture of new and old. And so what you see here is, again, this really minimal and modern dining room table setup paired with this antique piece. And how the space is brought all together is by actually layering in pieces such as that rug that has a traditional feel and a warm color palette to pull in the warmth of the antique piece. And then a lighting fixture that sort of has a little bit more of an antique vibe, but is somewhat minimal in its appearance. And so again, here we have this opportunity where you can have these new and old pieces living side by side. So the next thing that we'll talk about tonight, the third of our elements of scale, is this notion of formal and casual. So when we think about formality versus casualness in a space, when I think formality, my favorite thing to think about is the living room you weren't allowed to go into when you were growing up. Maybe that was your parents' house, your grandparents' house, a friend's house. Maybe you even had a grandparent or a parent who went so far as to cover the sofa and chairs in plastic just to make sure that they were preserved. But this formal aspect that we see sometimes in regular people's homes and other times in quite regal, maybe estates, maybe very wealthy people's homes, there's a formal aspect to a living space. And when we say formality in living spaces, we kind of have a more traditional floor plan. We have furniture that feels very tailored. Furniture, I like to think about pieces that you might sit upright in. So in the formal spaces, you're not going in and you're not lounging or slouching. It's not a space where you would watch TV, for example. It's going to be very pulled together and sort of look perfect all the time. And so that's why I like to always think about those living rooms that we never went in that always seemed perfect. Not a pillow was out of place, and they were really ready for more formal entertaining or kind of those impressive spaces that really asked for us to be adults and grown-ups and to have very nice and conversations with each other while casually sipping a cup of tea, maybe. As opposed to a more casual layout or floor plan or style that really invites you to sit down, to sink back into the sofa, maybe to read a book, to watch TV, to lounge. A space that feels a little bit more welcoming and inviting, potentially a space that feels more appropriate for family gatherings or for kids to sit down and color on the table, a space that maybe you wouldn't freak out as much if someone spilled a glass of wine. You might freak out a little bit still, but it would be a space where you're kind of expecting life to happen, and you're expecting maybe to wear some more comfortable clothes in those spaces. So when we think about these different styles, styles that lean more formal are things with terms like classic, formal, Hollywood glam, traditional. Styles that lean more casual, if you're searching for these terms, I would say eclectic, bohemian, rustic, even mid-century modern. Spaces, again, that are more about livability. So there's definitely a balance, though. So for those of you who are sort of unsure, you maybe are sitting there and thinking, you don't want a really formal space, but you're not sure, you're the boho type that has pillows on the floor and is, like lounging around in your space. There's definitely always a happy medium. And this is probably the spectrum where we see a lot of that happy medium happening in the spaces that are most compelling to our Modsy customer base. So here we have a space that we're calling a traditional collector space. So someone who is traditional in their style, but they're also a collector. They're a little bit more modern. They're incorporating elements that they're finding along their life path, along their journeys. And so here, the formal elements of this space, the room itself, the architecture has a formality to it with that fireplace and those two beautiful built-in bookshelves. The pieces of furniture themselves, the sofa paired with the two chairs in front of the fireplace, do feel a little bit more structured and maybe a little bit more formal, but we break the formality here with the layout of the space. So rather than have two matching sofas, we have that really beautiful ruffle skirted sofa that is armless, that has a little bit more of a casual feel, right? Without arms, you have this maybe a little bit more of a laid back stylistic feel to it. The pillows are kind of tossed a little bit more on that sofa. It has a little accent table pulled up to it. It's not following this it's not following this template of symmetry that we might see in the formal living rooms, but a lot of the pieces are calling on that tradition. And then our coffee table here as well is introducing a little bit more casualness. It's a storage coffee table. It feels rustic. It feels like it's something that maybe was collected over time. It has a little bit of a history to it. Something that might even be a little bit more on the casual side is a bohemian space. So here, this space pulls in bohemian and glam elements, creating something that feels, again, probably a little bit more towards the casual spectrum, but where we see formal elements introduced are in a couple of the materials. And so some of the pieces in the space, that gold palm marble topped accent table that's in the front of the space, has a little bit of an elevated feel to it, right? The materials there, the marble, the gold tone metal, even the shape of it feel a little bit more formal, a little bit more sculptural, versus the coffee tables, for example, feel a little bit more relaxed. Like if you're thinking of, sometimes when I think of casual, I think of maybe like places you go on vacation, what a hotel lobby might look like in Hawaii, or if you're going somewhere where you want a relaxed feel, that's where we sometimes see the casualness coming out in design and style. Other ways this room introduces a few more casual elements are the way that the art is sort of stacked and leaning on the floor and on the fireplace mantle. So it's something that is a little bit more organically designed, as opposed to the formality that we might have in a space that is designed and all of your art is hung, and it's hung and it stays there forever. There feels like there's a little bit more fluidity here, which may add to the casual feeling of the space. The materials as well, I think, invite you to have a little bit more of a casual feel. So the fourth spectrum that we'll talk about is this organic versus fabricated. And so these two terms, you might be thinking like, oh my gosh, how do these relate to design? So when we think of organic in the world of interior design, organic is really about the materials, the shapes, and the forms of the pieces. So we're really looking at pieces that feel like they are part of the natural world. Maybe we're even somehow conceived by the natural world, either in their materials, so they're using materials that are natural and organic materials, or their shapes are evocative of the things that we see in nature. So we might see more curved and rounded edges. We might see pieces like tree trunk accent tables, pieces that are actually taking shapes from nature. But really it's more of a softer feel, right? Something that feels like it has it's taking its inspiration from the natural world. And now when we say fabricated on the other end of that spectrum, we're thinking about pieces that are designed. So pieces that are either the shape of them, the form of them, the style of them. It's clear that these pieces are designed by a human, that they have a clear guiding hand. So maybe they are ornately carved pieces. Maybe they're very structured and rigid, but they're pieces that you look at and you know, wow, like that is something that came from an artisan. We also, in this fabricated world, think about materials. So thinking about synthetic materials, man-made materials, or things that feel, you might even think lean a little more industrial. So metals, lacquers, things that you wouldn't just stumble upon if you were on a hike in nature. You would not see a lacquered leaf or a metal tree. Now, granted, some of the metallic elements obviously are coming from nature, but thinking about them in this way where it's taking a human hand to really shape and form them. So key words to think about for these two different stylistic tent poles are, in organic, we might search for things like eclectic, rustic, farmhouse, coastal. Organic is actually a term that will yield great search results if you search organic interior design. It's one that's been used since the mid-century to describe the shape and form of pieces. And then fabricated, if you're someone who really likes or thinks about, oh, I'm leaning more towards these rooms that feel a little bit more fabricated, terms to search for might be industrial, modern, minimal. So what does this look like combined? So combined, we have this image, which I realize is incorrectly tagged. I would tag this one a mid-century minimal image. Not modern farmhouse, so I apologize for that one. But this is an image that really is mixing some organic shapes. So mid-century furniture oftentimes is really known for its organic shape. So when we look at that coffee table, we see these rounded edges, and we see the form is quite sculptural, but it's really kind of mimicking some of the forms that we might see in the natural world. And then it's pairing that with shapes that are much more fabricated. And so the way that we look at actually like the chairs at the dining table that have a sharp V for their arms, that lighting fixture in above the dining table as well, which is really, it actually kind of feels like maybe it's taking inspiration from a tree, but we see this piece that feels quite fabricated in this dark black metal. And then the room chair in the front is a piece that I actually think really beautifully harmonizes these two ideas of organic and fabricated. The shape of the chair itself, it's soft, it has rounded edges. Eero Saarinen actually designed it as a chair that was supposed to feel, he called it the womb chair. It was a chair that was meant to really cuddle with the person who is sitting in it, to really kind of respond to the shape of the human body in this very organic and natural way. But when you look at the legs on a chair like that, they feel quite fabricated as well. And so we have these chrome metal legs that really, it's quite obvious that this is something that is coming out of the brain of an artisan or a designer. So if you are drawn to a mixture of these styles, again, mid-century is a great style for you to lean in a little bit to organic, but also maybe pull in some of the fabricated elements. Another place that you might really find some inspiration is in the this combination of some Bohemian elements. And so here we have a space that feels actually quite transitional. And so we have these pieces of furniture like this sofa that feel somewhat organic in form, right? We have lines that are a little bit softer. The shape itself is something that really feels like it's a little bit more pillowy and cloud-like. Combined with, let's say, that accent table that feels much more fabricated, something that you can almost envision the hand of the artist shaping the legs of that table, as well as those side chairs. The shape itself is a little bit softer. We see rounded edges, and we see these really beautiful natural organic elements paired with these really soft and natural materials that give them this feeling of being a little bit more derived from nature, something that kind of connects us to the natural world. So the fifth and final element that we'll talk about tonight, or the scale that we'll talk about tonight, is this notion of safe to adventurous. So everybody, maybe, no one really wants to call themselves as safe, but in interior design and in the design world, it's totally okay to be safe. It's totally okay to be safe. It's totally okay to be adventurous. And you might be really adventurous in life, and you might find yourself designing your spaces to be a little bit more safe. So what do we mean when we say safe and adventurous? So a safe space, a space that feels a little bit more safe, is a space that will be really, I would say, a little bit less bold in choices, a little bit less trend forward. So a space that's really incorporating objects, pieces of furniture, decor that might lean a little bit more traditional, that might be a little bit less pattern forward, that might have a little bit more of a neutral color palette. Something that when you look at it, it doesn't date itself. Whereas a space that's a little bit more adventurous, these are the spaces that are going to be probably a little more wild, layering different colors. They might be indulging in trends and changing out pieces every few years to stay on top of trends. They're probably going to be incorporating really sculptural elements, really bold materials. So words that you might use to describe these two spectrums: for the safe side, contemporary, transitional, modern, rustic. Those are great places to start if you're thinking, I'm not a risk taker in interior design. Or if you're thinking, you want to design something once and kind of be done for a good 5 to 10 years, you might want a space that feels a little bit safer. And now if you're on the other end and you're someone who's thinking, I want to go bold, I want to go big, think about terms like eclectic, bohemian, Hollywood glam, and think about making big splashes with color, pattern, and form. So what might these look like in a happy medium? So you don't have to be just one or the other. And ways to really harmoniously combine safe and adventurous spaces are through styles. You might have heard the term California modern. This is a style that's pretty trendy right now, and it does a beautiful job at really combining what we would think about as as some safe elements, so some transitional furniture that feels like it will stand the test of time, with some pops that are a little bit more edgy and daring, a little bit more adventurous. So when we look at this California modern space, we see something that is, the sofa is, it's really comfortable. It's this really beautiful sectional. It feels like it could be in style for a long time. It's maybe a little bit more adventurous in that rust color than just say a gray or a neutral. But that color tone is still one that's quite classic and earthy. And so it's not quite as wild as the yellow citrine sofa that we have in that adventurous image. The wall color as well here is a little bit adventurous. That sort of deep smoky gray green is definitely taking us outside of maybe that typical neutral comfort zone that we use a lot of times on our wall colors. And then the pops of color throughout the space too. So the purple pillows, the green pillows, the yellow, the artwork that's pulling in those colors, those are all adding these little adventurous moments so that we have a space, again, that on the whole is fairly comfortable and somewhat safe, and actually feels like, doesn't feel too trendy, but it's one that has these moments of wow and these pops. Another way to think about combining these two styles is in a style here we call comfortably chic. And so this is a style that is sort of combining some elements of the transitional and elements of glam. And so glam, again, is one that we think of as being adventurous at times. That's where we have a lot of gold, prints, bold colors, whereas transitional is usually pieces that are really meant to be in style for longer periods of time. And so here in this image, it actually has quite a, maybe you might even think of this as an adventurous color palette, right? The sofa is in this blush pink. But the sofa shape is one that's is actually quite transitional and one that would be in style for a long time. The color palette, though, pushes it to be a little bit adventurous, but it's not so highly saturated that it doesn't necessarily feel maybe as bold, because the colors are a little bit softer than, say, the colors that we have in that adventurous image. We also have these chairs that have like this mid-century modern shape to them. And they have a little bit of these glam elements. So the velvet texture of them and those gold legs, they have that mid-century shape that is something that is, a staple of our design language, but they're delivered in a way that might have a little bit more shock and pop than a traditional mid-century shape. Then the rug itself, the rug is beautifully saturated with many different colors. The pattern is quite traditional. And so this is a pattern that you could see in a traditional space, and layered in here really creates a foundation that makes this space feel like it does have traditional elements, and it could lean, it gives it that safety so it's not so out there and so wild. The bookshelf is something I'll also call out as well. It's quite minimal and quite restrained in its form. And that's really adding to, you could do something quite wild and sculptural there, but to keep this space feeling a little bit more in the middle of the spectrum, it has this bookshelf that really is kind of subdued and a little bit more calming. So those are our 5 scales that we're thinking about as we try to help you understand and think about your own style. So you might think about, again, where do you fall? Going through each of these different scales, thinking, are you more of a person who was drawn to some of the emptier images or some of the more full images? Are you more drawn to old? Are you more drawn to new? Are you someone who's looking for more formal or more casual spaces? Organic, more fabricated? Are you more safe or adventurous? And where you fall on these, it might differ depending on the room that you're looking to design. Maybe in your bedroom, you're looking for something that's more safe and organic, but your living room, you want something that is really adventurous and full, and really maybe a little bit more pattern forward and color forward. And it's okay. Like you don't have to commit to something and be that forever for every room of your space. This is just a framework for how you might think about designing certain spaces. And so what we'll do next is we'll look at a couple of spaces and sort of judge where and how they fall on this spectrum. And so you can kind of get a sense of maybe how you might develop this spectrum in your own world. So the first space here, this is Kendall Jenner's living room. It was just published maybe last month or the month before as Architectural Digest. A space that we were all super drawn to. I think it's just like a really beautiful space. When we think about this on our spectrums here, so it's not super minimal. It leans more towards full, but we see some minimal elements in the architecture and the treatment of the overall surface styling of the space. So if you look at, for example, the fireplace mantle and the decor there, we're seeing restraint in some of the elements there. Again, the architecture and the treatment and the color of the walls is a little bit more restrained, which is why this room is not maxing out on the full scale. But it is pretty full. When you look at the coffee table, it's very designed. There are a lot of elements on the coffee table. Each of the sofas feels very, they're both layered with pillows, and their shape and their style are really, they're adding a lot of elements to the room. When we look at the old to the new scale, we're skewing much closer to old here. The space actually incorporates a number of antiques, and then even the pieces that are modern have a little bit more of an antique feel to them. So we have the space. It doesn't feel though, we're pushing a lot towards that quote unquote old scale, but it doesn't necessarily feel, for those Gilmore Girl fans of you, it's not the Emily Gilmore old, right? It's not just this room that's filled with Chippendale furniture, but it's filled with antiques, and it's filled with pieces that have a patina and a feeling of history to them. On the classic formal scale, this one is kind of in the middle, but maybe leaning a little bit more towards formal, so that the two sofas kind of right across from each other, really, it has more of a formal designed feel to it, maybe than a sofa and a couple of lounge chairs with ottomans would. Organic versus fabricated. Here we see some shapes. I think we're leaning a little bit more organic in this. The shapes of the sofa, the way that they are slip covered and draped, kind of has more of a flowy feel to it. The textures in the space have a very organic feel to them. Even the materials in the architecture are kind of leaning a little bit more towards that organic side. So that's what we're seeing, that a lot in the materials and the textures. And then safe versus adventurous. Let's say this is a little bit more on the safe side. So while it feels really different than so much of what we're seeing in the pages of shelter magazines today, it's one that is quite traditional and is really calling upon the traditional elements of design to bring it to life. So here's a great example of one that it is a little bit, more safe, but it's really beautiful. Safe doesn't have to mean boring. So the next image that we'll look at is a classic image of a very mid-century minimal dining room, something that really is a hugely popular style today. So when we look at the empty to full scale, this one feels like it veers a little bit more towards the empty. Now, it's not quite as stark and empty as that tentpole image that we used. That was Kim and Kanye's space, by the way, if you didn't know, of the all-white living room. This one has much more to it, but stylistically, it's pretty reserved and pretty minimal. So we'll push it a little bit more towards that empty spectrum. When we think of old versus new, well, we have a lot of mid-century inspired elements. The space is really leaning much more towards the new. So we're not seeing antiques here. And again, there's a little bit of that mid-century vintage vibe, but it feels fresh, it feels new. The casual to formal, this one we felt like was kind of squarely right in the middle. It feels like a pretty typical dining room. It's not super formal, and it's not super casual. So it feels like a nice balance between the two, a space you could eat dinner in every day. It doesn't feel too stuffy or too uptight, but it also doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel super bohemian or super casual. The organic and fabricated here, we're pushing it a little bit more towards organic because of the materials, especially the wood. So seeing the natural wood here, the curvature, especially of the chairs, the shape of the table, kind of pushes it a little bit organic. But again, these pieces feel, they feel really beautifully designed, right? They feel like we see the hand of the craftsperson in them. And then finally, the safe versus adventurous. So this one feels safe. I think it feels it leans much more safe than adventurous. We have materials that are, wood, which is quite a safe material here, right? Something we're all familiar with. The color palette is really safe here. Even the patterns introduced are leaning towards patterns that are quite familiar. And the space itself, it's not taking any bold risks or adventurous risks, but it's really beautiful. So again, just because it's safe doesn't mean it's boring. So this next image, this is a Bunny Williams image. If any of you are familiar with Bunny, she's an interior designer, fantastic, known really for some quite formal traditional spaces. So here, when we look at the empty to full scale, this one feels like it's really pushing towards the fullness of that. And so where we get the fullness is not just from the amount of stuff in the room, but also from the use of pattern. It's like we've got the wallpaper pattern, the pattern in the drapery, even the bookshelf. It's quite full itself, but the bookshelf also has pattern on it. So it's painted or it has inlay on it that's creating that pattern. We see patterns on the upholstered furniture, on the rugs. So the fullness of this space, again, is not just the amount of stuff that's in it, but it's the way that pattern and material are used to make, to really create moments everywhere our eye looks. On the old versus new scale, this one is really pushing it for old, right? We've got a lot of pieces here that are likely antiques themselves or really pulling inspiration from antique pieces. And there's nothing here that really feels like it is really, really modern or new, but rather the space is finding beauty in these more traditional, older, antique and vintage elements. Formal to casual, this space is really formal. It's maybe kind of a great dictionary image of what you might think about when you think of interior design, and how a designer might make a space look, right? It's following all the rules. It's incorporating all the things that we expect to have in a space. We have furniture that makes you feel a little bit more upright, maybe a little bit more rigid. It doesn't seem like a space that you might curl up and watch TV or eat a bowl of popcorn on the sofa. From the organic to fabricated, here, we're pushing this more towards the fabricated. And so again, when we think about that notion of pieces that are made by artisanal craftspeople, here we see that in the carving of that beautiful side chair, in the nail heads and the shape of that sofa, even in the bookshelf, like we commented. That bookshelf is about the material treatment, right? It's not like the image before where the pieces of furniture were about the natural wood that made them. This is about a person who crafted something that is stylized and designed. And then safe versus adventurous. I think this one is leaning much more adventurous. So there's a mixture of prints, of colors, of different antique pieces with more abstract art. It's really pushing the envelope for of what might be bold in a space, in a very different way than some of the other adventurous spaces we've seen, right? And so I think this is a time where we're seeing something that's quite old and using traditional pieces, but we're also saying it's really adventurous in the combination of those pieces. And then we have this space here, which is really bold and colorful. And so this one, when we look at, is quite different than some of the other spaces we've seen, but you'll notice some of the scale, the sliding scale, matches up in a couple of places. So for example, the empty versus full here, this one is quite, if we flip back to the Bunny Williams image, this one we actually see that empty versus full in the same place, but it looks really different, right? So here we have one that is, the room itself is full. We see a lot of accessories. We see a lot of prints and patterns. The old versus new, it's really kind of squarely in the middle there. We see a lot of pieces that are kind of evoking maybe vintage elements, like the mirror in the background. Some of the patterns have a little bit more of, those floral patterns have maybe a little bit of a Victorian feel to them. The sofa has a little bit of a mid-century feel, but then we have pieces that are feeling much more modern and much more new, such as the lamp. That mid-century sofa leans a little bit more towards the new, the coffee table as well. So we're not really, it's not quite as vintage or old, though we do have these vintage moments. In the formal versus casual, this one is much more casual than the image we were just looking at. So we have, I think you might feel quite comfortable lounging here, curling up your feet and watching a movie, maybe even eating that bowl of popcorn, drinking a glass of wine. It feels, the use of the stacked books instead of a side table adds to the casualness here, right? It's not fully designed. It's not this space that every element was thought out and brought in, but there's these casual moments here. Organic to fabricated here, we're kind of right in the middle, maybe leaning slightly more towards the organic side. And I would say, as we think about some of the elements in the room, actually those plant elements in the room are creating this organic feel. The use of the wooden cutting boards as objects of design, some of the shapes that we see in there, and some of the floral aspects are kind of leaning towards that little bit more organic feel. And then safe versus adventurous. This room is certainly pushing us to the adventurous side. The use of patterns, that rug paired with the different patterns in the pillows, the use of bold colors, again in the rug and the pillows, and then that blush sofa. That is quite a bold statement to have a big pink sofa in your living room. Like, this person is really going out on a limb and being adventurous. So that's where we've landed for thinking of your style. I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. So Karina, Maddie, if there's any questions that you think would be great ones to answer live, let me know.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, thanks so much, Alessandra. If you have additional questions, I think Karina and I were furiously typing throughout the presentation to get you answers, but if there's any more, type them in now. But while you're noodling on your great question, there was one I saw come up quite a bit from a few different people asking how to think about style across different rooms, especially rooms that are connected, where you can see like an open living dining room, for example. Like, you have to have the same style in reader room. Is there any tips on how to integrate if you're going different routes? What are your thoughts there, Alessandra?
I think when you have rooms that are clearly open to another room, you want to have some sort of continuity. And so that doesn't necessarily mean we could go two ways. One, and actually if we think about our scale here, if you want to play it safe on the scale of safe to adventurous, I would say think about those two rooms 100% like cohesively, right? So you could think about designing them as if they are a singular space, having a shared color palette, a shared style in those two rooms. If you want to be a little bit more adventurous, or you want to introduce a couple of elements that are a little bit more bold, I would say you want to have some sort of continuity between the two spaces. And that continuity might come between some shared stylistic elements, a shared color palette, for example. But you could really think about, maybe if you're someone who you're leaning between like mid-century and minimal for two different spaces, you might have a similarly shared surface styling approach that feels minimal in both spaces. or you might have a table in your dining room that's a little bit more minimal, that kind of calls upon a coffee table that's a little bit more minimal in your living room, but one space leads more mid-century, one space leads more minimal. You might think if you're someone who's really into glam, you might introduce a shared metallic element. So you might have gold tones in your living room and gold tones that pop up in your dining room and some of the metal accents. But you might have something that feels a little bit more of, I think you could have a space like this comfortably chic space that could be paired with a space that is a little bit more organic and might have a couple pops of these golden elements in them.
While we're on this, Alessandra, I got a question about pink. Is pink a new neutral right now in base furniture? And like, how are we thinking about that?
That is a great question. And I would say pink is a neutral depending on where you fall on the spectrum. So if you are someone who is more adventurous on the adventure spectrum, pink might certainly feel like a neutral for you. And it's something that is, we've seen pink now 4 or 5 years, I would say, trending. And so it's something I think that has become part of our interior design vocabulary, much more so than it was 10 years ago. But if you're someone who's really safe, I think pink might still be outside of your neutral comfort zone. And so I think that's where you might think about what do your neutrals look like, depending on where you live on this spectrum.
That's great. Okay, what about the difference between modern and contemporary? We've touched on this like a couple times, but do you have like an elevator pitch for the difference between contemporary and modern?
So, I mean, if we get really into the semantics, technically they have different definitions. To be totally honest, the two words are used so interchangeably, especially in the world of the internet, that if you find yourself thinking like, oh, I like this, I would just search for both on Pinterest and on Google. Technically, when we think about them, contemporary is supposed to be more about this sort of the moment furniture. It had a really big usage in the 1980s when we started to see a lot of these like Italian and European designers creating these quote unquote contemporary spaces that are, if you follow like the 80s interior on Instagram, or if you're just watching a lot of 80s TV like I am these days, that contemporary is part of that vocabulary. So modern, a lot of times when people use modern today, they might be talking about mid-century modern, or they might be just talking about a general feel of a space that does feel fresh and new. So again, I would say there are differences. Colloquially, the differences are very, very hard to define, and the two words are used interchangeably so often that a linguistics expert would probably really chastise us and tell us we have to use one over the other, but our whole society is just mixing them. And so don't be afraid to misuse one term or use them both or use them interchangeably.
That's great, Alessandra, thanks. What about like Scandinavian styles? I think some of the imagery in this presentation kind of like hit that, but we might have not necessarily like spoken about what Scandinavian style is and like how to kind of incorporate those modern pieces with something that's a little bit maybe more rustic or a little bit more personal.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to try, let's find like a good image that might be somewhat leaning towards like a Scandinavian style. I feel like, I know we're not hitting on it really super well in any of our images, but if we think about our style spectrum, so Scandinavian styles pull a lot from mid-century, and they pull a lot from the organic movement of the mid-century pieces. So I would say if you're someone who's drawn to these sort of organic shapes, really use of organic materials and textures, and then where I would also say that Scandinavian styles fall more casual. So really spaces that feel warm, inviting, that feel like you could really live in them. And then with the old to new, I'd say they're probably kind of like right in the middle of that. So bold for us. Maybe there's some pieces that feel like they are, you know, that they're going to feel very mid-century derived. But they're not going to feel necessarily brand new. They're not going to feel like they were just made today. So they might feel like they have a little bit of a story. And then empty to full, I would say Scandinavian spaces are known for being a little bit more minimal. They're definitely taking inspiration from Japanese minimalism in the mid-century. And so we see that in these Scandinavian spaces. And I would say on the last, I didn't do this in order, but on the safe to adventurous, I think they're pretty safe. There are spaces that feel, they might feel slightly adventurous in their use of high contrast, but I would say like just maybe bumped like slightly towards that, but not really. I would say they're not going to be high saturation, high pattern. You might see some sort of Marimekko pattern introduced to a Scandinavian space that has a high contrast print to it. But generally we see really neutral textures with some bold pops within those neutrals, which I know we talked about a little bit last week. So if you're thinking about like, oh great, what does that mean? Watch last week's episode, and we go through that idea of like color and bold neutrals. I think we maybe have time for like one more question.
Ooh. Okay.
Well,
Fran, do
you
you have
could
any
probably
like...
squeeze in two. I could answer fast.
I have one, and it's a little bit more broad. It's kind of about, you touched on a magazine very briefly. I think it was called Shelter. And maybe just like 2 other or 3 other of your favorite inspirational sources that you're looking at, Alessandra.
Okay, and let me clarify. When I said shelter magazines, I actually mean a category of magazines that deal with home. So that is kind of maybe that was me with my like nose up snobby like design world, like shelter magazines. But we talk about, when we say shelter magazines, we mean essentially magazines that deal with the whole home category. Within that, what I love are, I love Veranda. Veranda is one of my favorites. It always leans a little bit more traditional. I love El Decor, of course, AD. I mean, you can't not love those two. Wallpaper is a fantastic place. They go beyond just interior design. Off the top of my head, those are some of my favorites. I mean, I love looking at everyone, like, you know, House Beautiful, even some more traditional Town and Country is great too. Yeah, I think there's a lot of great magazines out there. And I would say, I'm trying to think if any others are popping to mind. I know Maddie, Karina, you guys might have a list too that you can add to.
The Modsy blog. I mean, I am on there all the time. So
great place for plug. I love it. I mean, I also love Domino. I think that skews a little bit more young millennial, but you know, I love it. It's fun. They always do awesome home tours of some like fun celebrities. So I think they just recently did Aisha Curry's house. So that's a fun one in the area.
Yeah, Domino's great too. Great.
Mm-hmm.
We're right at time here. We have one more question. I'll do it.
Okay, here's a good one to close out on. Say, Alessandra, you just love both sides of the spectrum and you can't decide, or maybe you sit in the middle and you're just equally torn. How do you choose?
You know what? I think how do you choose? That's a great question. I would say you allow yourself to organically grow into one of those sides of the spectrum over time. I think you kind of like, sometimes it's hard to choose in one moment. And so you might kind of just say like, I love these both. Watch what you buy over a period of time and see where you organically grow, what you gravitate towards. Another thing that you could do is pin like crazy, save Instagram posts like crazy, and go back through and like literally count how many you have that hit, like if it's the empty full, like which one wins out in your inspirational board, because that's kind of like, that's the one that you're just like maybe a little bit more drawn to. If we want to go data analytics on ourselves, I would say just count like, okay, I've got 10 formal and only 7 casual, so it seems like I'm a little bit more drawn towards formal.
Yeah. And maybe also a good thing, an exercise I personally go through is, you know, love these gorgeous bold spaces. Do I want to live in it? You know, maybe there's a line to tease out there just because you love looking at them, and maybe pull in an accessory or two, or just kind of incorporate it in small ways, but I don't necessarily want to live in a dark purple room, even though I love looking at pictures of them.
It's a great question to ask yourself. Yeah, do I want to live with this, and can I live with it for a while? Because any change you make to your interior design and your decor is usually somewhat permanent, right? It's we cut our hair frequently, we change our fashion frequently, but it's a lot harder to repaint a room or buy a whole new sofa. Cool.
Hear, hear.
Great. Well, I appreciate so much everyone who came and shared this time with us tonight. We have one more session as part of Interior Design and You, and that is next Thursday at 4 p.m. It might give you a nice, wonderful break, something to look forward to next Thursday. 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. You can sign up, you can pre-register. We'll send you guys out a thank you email with a link to watch this in case you want to watch it again, and a link to the presentation. And you can always find more on our blog, our podcast, The Render, and Instagram at Modsy Design. So again, thank you all so much for spending the time with us tonight. Really appreciate it. And please feel free to reach out to us on Instagram if you have any feedback.
Yeah, thanks everyone so much.
Thanks, guys.